1 week ago, on January 30th, organizers urged people around the United States to stop working, attending schools, and spending money altogether to protest Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The event reportedly drew thousands of participants across the country, fueled by outrage over the agency's conduct in Minneapolis, including the fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy by federal agents. Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm your host, Pete Zaroka, and today we're examining the January 30th shutdown, its effects, and how it fits into the history of labor action in the United States. I'm joined by Michael McQuarrie, a sociologist and director of ASU Center for Work and Democracy. He studies protest, labor action, and how ordinary people try to exercise power in political systems that often exclude them. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Pete.
Let's get right into it.
Okay.
Let's define some terms.
Okay.
When we talk about a strike versus a shutdown versus a protest, are these different things? Are they all the same thing?
They are different things. So a strike has a very specific meaning. It refers to the withdrawal of labor from a workplace to prevent the economic activity that enables owners of capital to derive profit.
Okay.
So it is meant to be explicitly economically disruptive, and the target is the firm that employs the workers. A general strike, which I think we'll also be talking about a little bit today, is an expansion of that to disrupt economic activity more generally and affect and target a capitalist class. Okay. Now, this can stretch into politics, and we'll talk about that. Shutdowns are efforts to shut down economic activity, not necessarily by withdrawing labor, and this could come through a number of things. Consumer boycotts.
Right.
It could come through blocking the infrastructure that you need to make money.
Okay.
So the Yellow Vests in 2018 blockaded Amazon warehouses.
Right.
The Birmingham bus boycott.
Yeah.
One of the founding mobilizations of the civil rights movement. That was an economic shutdown of sorts, and it was meant to cause a crisis in the fiscal finances of the city of Birmingham.
Okay.
Right? So that's a much broader category, and it doesn't necessarily refer to the withdrawal of labor. And a protest can be any sort of thing that is meant to signal a public's attitude about something. So a lot of civil rights protests, they were meant to draw attention to an injustice, mobilize a public against the existing order of things, and get things changed legislatively and so on. So that's the core of what a protest might do.
Right. January 30th was a combination of all those things. People were stopping labor. They were stopping commerce, as in not spending money. Some businesses even shut down. And then there was a protest element of it as well, where people were taking to the streets. Who would you say was the audience for that action in general? Because when you talked about all those different definitions, there are different audiences for all of them in theory.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually particularly clear. I think with a lot of sort of anti-Trump protests in general, it is meant to express public dissatisfaction with the president.
Right.
And in terms of general strike / economic shutdown, I would say that was much more limited in effect. And in fact, what it ended up looking a lot like was a lot of No Kings protests. You have a lot of people.
Yeah.
They're mobilized.
Yeah.
And they are expressing dissatisfaction, but they're doing so in relatively conventional modes of protest. People gather, they express their opinions, they carry signs, people make speeches, things like that. Some people leave work, but there's not usually an organized effort to disrupt a workplace
right.
That you would have with like a labor strike, right?
How do you, broadly speaking, how do you measure a strike's efficacy? How do we know if it worked, quote unquote?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's an old organizing adage, which is the action's in the reaction, right? So if there's no reaction...
you didn't do a good job.
You did not do a good job.
Okay.
One of the things that's happened over the last 40 years is the sort of protests where people march on the Mall in Washington or march at the State House here in Phoenix. These kinds of protests are much less likely to have an effect on anything or generate much of a reaction than they once did. But in terms of the reaction in this case, I haven't seen a whole lot from the January 30th protest. January 23rd, very different story, and we can talk about that if you want to.
I would like to talk about that, but before we get there, so the January 30th shutdown. Do you know what its expressed goals were? And then what do we know about how effective or how much of a reaction there was to that action? And if it's too early to judge, are there any signals that you think are notable?
So, there has been more conversations about what ICE is doing. The protests on January 30th, January 23rd can be said to be contributing to a shift in public mood about ICE. Polls are showing that support is declining.
Yeah.
Republicans are much less trusted now than they used to be on dealing with the issues of immigration, also the economy.
Yeah.
So, to some extent, these protests can have the effect of bringing an issue to public attention and polarizing opinion around it. Okay. It's sort of asking people to take a side. Right?
Yeah.
I think we'll have to see how much the January 30th one actually had an impact on that. Then there's another effect which actually isn't about the political targets, and that is, are you generating the capacity to mobilize more effectively in the future? So by getting somebody out to a protest on January 3rd, are you making it possible to get more people out to a protest on, February 6th?
Right. You're laying the groundwork. It's a test run.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you extending organizing networks? Are you refining your message? Because the messages in January 30th were pretty general, and no ICE or ICE out, things like that, right?
So you mentioned the January 23rd protests, or strike, I should say, earlier, and that was a general strike in Minnesota. And by some accounts, it was the first general strike in 80 years. I saw some reporting. And I saw some polling this morning that 38% of respondents to the poll, they participated in the strike one way or another, either by not going to work or because their workplace was shut down. Is that good? Is 38% good? I have no frame of reference for what is good participation in a general strike.
It's the most significant outpouring of civic support for an action like that in the 21st century.
Wow. Okay.
In the United States.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's the first legitimate effort to have a general strike since, curiously enough, Minneapolis in 1934.
Oh.
Which was the last real general strike.
Okay.
There's also a general strike in San Francisco at about the same time. That is a tremendous level of support. Especially when we think that it is in opposition to the federal government, which traditionally has a fair amount of legitimacy with most people.
Yeah.
So this is something that is truly exceptional. And it was much more of a general strike than a protest in some ways. Although it's important to note, lots of workers did not walk off the job. So it was a combination of this sort of protest, shutdown, strike that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Right. So there were unions that called people out. The teachers union had already called for ending requiring in-class instruction because ICE was tear gassing in front of preschools and stuff. And they attacked Roosevelt High School on January 7th, I think. So the idea was the workplace isn't safe. We can't ask kids to come in and things like that. So some unions were already very mobilized. But, a lot of this also goes to the labor organizing that's been going on in Minneapolis over the last 6-7 years, which is rooted a lot in the uprising of 2020 and so on. So you actually had a urban labor movement in Minneapolis, which was building towards this kind of moment already for several years, which meant that when this moment happened, they were actually quite ready.
Wow.
And the problem with extending the analogy from Minneapolis to other places is that most cities have not had that kind of organizing. And most cities did not just go through another example of this kind of thing in 2020.
Yeah.
So in Minneapolis, you actually have a very well-prepared, very highly organized, not exceptionally strong, but exceptionally effective labor movement. And that's really what the backbone of this was. Urban sociologists call this place character. The idea that different cities or different locales actually have things that are distinctive about them that make different kinds of things possible.
Right.
And Minneapolis really does have a place character. So if you ask like organizational sociologists who study like nonprofit populations and density, right? Minneapolis is thick with that stuff. Phoenix, much thinner, right? And that speaks to a certain amount of civic efficacy that is possible by citizenries, right?
Yeah.
And Minneapolis is quite exceptional in that regard in the first place, even before any of this happened, right?
The general strikes in Minnesota, pretty regional, right? highly focused.
Yep.
Is there a trade-off between a local strike like that, which is highly disruptive in one place, versus like something like a general national strike that might be a little less effective because of the place character you're talking about, or the differences of place character, but it's more visible?
Goes to what the actual strategy is that you're deploying. If the goal is disruption, then concentration is actually usually going to be much more effective.
Okay.
And again, if the action's in the reaction, the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies in Minneapolis reacted right away.
They issued a big letter, right?
Big nothing burger letter, but they still issued a letter. But more importantly, small businesses were extremely supportive of this, and much more obviously supportive than the Fortune 500 companies. So you really did have something like a shutdown. So the concentration of activity and organizing there really did have an impact. And it's interesting. It puts politicians in the state in a really uncomfortable position, right? And that's part of the effect as well. One of the goals here is to sort of isolate the mayor and the governor into taking action to protect the citizenry,
right?
Something which they really don't want to, a position they really don't want to be in. That kind of concentrated effect is extremely important. It's extremely important as an example for the rest of the nation in terms of like what you can see as possible.
Yeah.
Because again, nobody's done anything like this in decades.
So I would be remiss in my role as a podcaster not to make this all about myself. So I was curious, if I were to participate in something like the January 30th shutdown, and I'm here in Phoenix, I'm not in Minneapolis, I work in an office, I don't do something transactional or classically productive. I'm not making springs in a factory or bread or whatever, right? Does my participation even matter?
It always matters.
Okay.
Any kind of economic activity that we do, whether at the university. So, notice we don't think of school children as being productive.
No, that's true.
School children are walking out.
Yeah.
And that's a signal to a lot of people. It's disrupting the normal functioning of everyday life. And that's really what the protesters in Minneapolis are asking for. Step outside of the idea that any of this is normal. To the extent that you're acting like it's normal, I think many of them would argue, you are pretending. This is not normal. I think a lot of people assume that protest is an extension of liberal politics, where you go out in support of your parties or whatever legislative issue.
Hold on. When you say liberal politics, I want you to...
I mean liberal polity in the sense of governed by rule of law, representative government. I don't mean liberal in the sense of on an ideological spectrum.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that for the audience.
No, very important thing to note. So I'm not talking about, who's liberal on abortion rights or whatever. Just the nature of the polity. Right. In that context, the idea is if it's actually representative or something that could be viewed as representative, protest often is viewed as a mechanism or a lever to pull to change laws.
Yeah.
So the civil rights movement, again, is a classic example. Protests, tremendous variety, produced the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. These are really important pieces of legislation.
Absolutely,
right? And in that sense was extremely effective in that sort of idea. But if the regime is not representative and it's not lawful and it's violent, then the logic of what the protest has to do is actually fundamentally different. If it's lawless, changing legislation is not going to matter, right? Then you're actually confronting a regime. And your protest isn't going to look so much like what Americans usually do. It's going to start looking more like what people in Iran do or people in Hong Kong or places like that. And that's actually what we're seeing in a lot of American protests. And it's not because people are taking their cues from there. It's because protesters aren't stupid. They understand that when police are shooting them in the face with rubber bullets, attacking legal observers, shooting at medics, we're not in a situation now where your right to protest is actually being very effectively guaranteed, and you need to act accordingly. So one thing I noticed in Minneapolis in 2020-21 when I was doing research there is the amount of people that were carrying weapons. People do not have the assumption that protests is going to be protected activity anymore. And that's partially due to the Trump regime. It's also due to the way police act, right? In the case of 2020-21, the governor was a Democrat and the mayor was a Democrat. Right? And in those kinds of situations, the logic of protest fundamentally shifts. It's about confronting a lawless regime more than trying to change legislation. And Minneapolis is probably, a couple other cities, maybe Portland, a couple other cities are very aware of this because they've been in this confrontation for a while now. Whereas the rest of the country, I think, still isn't there yet. They haven't had these experiences yet. And I think what you're going to see is a working out of what kind of protests we're going to be having in this country for the remainder of the Trump presidency.
I want to drill in on something you were just talking about how the method of a protest will shift based on what you're confronting. Yeah. It also makes me curious about how strikes in general have changed as our economy has changed.
Sure.
We shifted from a manufacturing to an agricultural economy, largely to a service one. So how does that change how one strikes?
So not that much.
Okay.
So the number one governing thing determining how strikes are conducted is labor law. So the National Labor Relations Act, which was importantly modified in 1947 to radically reduce the power of labor. The sit-down strikes were extremely scary to people in power in the 1930s. They were very effective. They mobilized and they organized basic industry, things like that. There were a series of restrictions that were put on the right to strike.
Okay.
And so that's the number one thing governing it now. So really the time that you can sort of strike in a way that's legally protected is at contract expiration and when the company has violated labor law. That's pretty restrictive.
Yeah.
Right. Now, people will strike outside of that. So the transit workers in New York, they're actually governed by a separate law. Transportation workers are governed by a separate labor law. But transportation workers in New York, who subway drivers and token booth attendants and things like that, bus drivers, they struck during the Bloomberg administration, and it was a wildcat strike, which means they'd been legally instructed that it was illegal to strike, and they struck anyway.
Okay.
And the consequence of that was that the union was basically bankrupted because unions pay triple damages when they violate labor law.
Oh.
When companies violate labor law, they have to post a sign in the workroom that says that they apologize. This is the nature of labor law in the United States. The restrictions on strikes are pretty extreme. So striking is quite restrictive in labor law, and the nature of employment actually doesn't have very much to do with it at all. One thing that does have a lot to do with it is how employees are classified. So the more important shift than the shift from manufacturing to services, which the last great wave of labor mobilization was in the 60s, and it was in healthcare, education, and public service.
Okay.
So all those are services.
Right.
And it organized millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
It's not like service work is a problem for striking or labor organizing. That's clearly not true. Think about, I was at NYU when we struck for our contract as a graduate student in the early 2000s, right? And now graduate students are one of the major waves of labor organizing that have been going on over the last 20 years, right? All services, right? It's things like when workers get classified as independent contractors rather than employees that has a much bigger effect on the possibility of organizing and striking. So, Amazon, for example, is a company that utilizes armies of independent contractors. They all drive Amazon trucks, but they're all classified as independent contractors. Uber won a ballot initiative in California just a few years ago to ensure that their employees wouldn't be reclassified as employees.
Because that would cut into their bottom line quite
Absolutely.
a lot, right?
Yeah. Their employees would have a lot more rights, and the fact that they were employees meant that they could organize collectively. As independent contractors, they can't.
Right.
The capacity to sort of do things outside of law is a muscle that was sort of lost by labor unions for a long time because the law was relatively friendly. The one sort of pushback was the Biden administration. So whatever you want to say about that administration, it was legitimately helpful to unions and workers in terms of giving very generous interpretations of labor law that really helped workers fight union busting and things like that.
Are you specifically talking about train workers were striking during the Biden administration? I remember that. That
was one. So again, they're covered by the transportation workers law, and in that particular legislation, the government can actually weigh in on whether or not the strike is economically disruptive enough to be rendered illegal.
Well,
which
defeats the purpose of a
it
strike?
absolutely defeats the purpose. And the Biden administration did declare their strike illegal.
Okay.
So they weighed in on the side of the railroads in that case. And Biden got in a lot of trouble with the labor movement over that.
So you've painted a very, I'll say, I guess, restrictive picture of what labor rights are in the United States right now. And it seems like they've been in decline for a while based on what you just told me. Is that still the status? Are we still in decline? Are we in more of a revival because of the things we're seeing in Minneapolis? Like, where would you place us?
So in terms of for unions, it's going to be interesting to see how how the Minneapolis thing plays out. What is definitely the case is that public support for unionization is at the highest levels in my lifetime, and it's not even close. And the main energy for that is young people who I think are looking at their economic prospects and going, we're in really deep trouble. We're not going to own a house. I'm not going to have a retirement. These kinds of things. People with college educations. I talk about this with students at ASU all the time. And I have students who are in unions because they're working as grocery store cashiers or something. It's not what it was for my generation at all. A lot of the assumptions that I had are not applicable. One of the problems is that unions mostly don't represent young people. So you have this big disconnect between the people that strongly want unions and where unions actually have members. And that's indicative of the barrier that people have in terms of forming unions and joining the labor movement, right? The people that want it the most can't get into it.
We've covered a lot of ground here in a fairly short amount of time. Do you have a takeaway for the audience about labor action or where we are right now?
About labor action and where we are. The largest group of organized people and organized money that acts in defense of working people is the labor movement.
Okay.
It is still, millions of people. It's got significant resources. It has mostly proven to be quite ineffective at deploying those resources. In many ways, they, like some kinds of protests, have become extensions of the Democratic Party. Which is problematic in this moment in particular when a lot of union members are actually Trump supporters. Not very much capacity to act collectively to actually deal with strategic questions. And even if they did, they'd run into the very strong barriers of law, mobilized companies against them. The labor movement's been acting for changes to labor law since the Carter administration. And even though they spend all this money and mobilize all these people to elect Democrats, there's been no effective labor law reform at all. So, it's a problem. And, more broadly, the problem of that is that, the Democrats have been acting on behalf of professionals, mostly not working people for a long time. So, a weak labor movement weakens democracy, I would argue. If you don't have effective organizations of working people, and it could be things other than unions. It could be cooperatives. It could be, other kinds of worker self-organization. It could even be churches, right?
Yeah.
Then if you don't have that, then democracy really is in danger. Yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you for coming on the show today. If someone wants to learn more about the labor movement, its history, or any of the other topics we discussed today, do you have some recommendations for reading, watching, listening?
Yeah, for this kind of thing, I will point to a classic, which is a book by Jeremy Brecker called Strike, which is actually a history of that as a form of action. I think that's very relevant for what we've been talking about.
For sure.
My colleague Ben Case at the Center for Work and Democracy has a book called Street Rebellions, which is not so much about strikes, but it is about the kind of thing that's been happening in Minneapolis. Charles Tilley, who's sort of a dean of social movement scholars, he passed a few years ago, has a book called Popular Contention in Great Britain, which looks at protests through the lens of repertoires of action. And I find that very, very useful for thinking about the moment as we transition from one repertoire of protest action to another. And then finally, Lawrence Goodwin's Breaking the Barrier, which is an example which is about solidarity in Poland, which was organized around striking workers and brought down the Soviet Empire. So
pretty effective.
Yeah, pretty effective.
I'll put those in the show notes for everyone to check out. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. I think your work is really interesting and important, especially where we find ourselves now. And hopefully I can have you on the show for a longer episode in the future.
Sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review in the podcast app of your choice. If you found us on YouTube, We'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe. Lab Coat Optional is a joint production of all the talented people at the Strategic Marketing and Communications team at Knowledge Enterprise at Arizona State University. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. Until next time, stay curious.